In March 1981, at the co-op scale on the edge of Marshall County near the Grundy Line, Ray West stepped down from a 1972 Chevrolet C20 with 286,000 miles, rust through both rear fenders, and a tailgate that only latched if you lifted it first. He wore faded overalls stitched at both knees, a canvas coat gone white at the seams, and gloves mended so many times the thread looked like contour lines on a map. Men who had never missed a machinery payment in their lives glanced once and sorted him into the category they understood. Behind, stubborn, one harvest away from the trouble. The visual arithmetic looked simple. New paint meant progress. Old iron meant decline. Then Trent Malloy walked across the gravel with dealership confidence polished into every detail, pressed shirt under a clean jacket, logo cap still stiff at the brim, truck parked where everybody could see the chrome. He sold expansion packages out of Blackhawk County and called them growth plans, usually with 3 signatures and variable paper hidden in the stack. He looked at Ray's wagon load, looked at Ray's boots, and laughed in a way meant for an audience. "You are still planting 640 acres with that 4020, he said. "How long do you think that holds?" Ray did not answer the joke. He handed over his scale ticket, accepted the moisture deduction without argument, and drove home behind the same 1968 John Deere 4020 he had maintained like a watch for 13 seasons. At his kitchen table, where the varnish had worn thin under 4 decades of checkbook work, the documented living costs sat in a ruled ledger that did not care about appearances. Property tax and insurance, $7,840, food, $6,450, utilities, $3,120, clothing, $520, machinery parts, $9,300. Total annual cash outflow, $27,230. Consumer debt, 0. No pickup note. No furniture account. No credit cards revolving at 19% while people talked about discipline in coffee shops. The hidden side of that same ledger was already stronger than most people in town guessed. Certificates of deposit, $418,000. Operating cash, $96,000. Note payments, none. Consequently, the man in patched overalls had more liquidity than several polished operators combined, but he carried it quietly because quiet costs less. Ray's framework had begun 23 years earlier, not from ideology, but from witnessing arithmetic break a family 3 farms over. In November 1958, when he was 12, he stood with his father behind a windbreak and watched an auctioneer sell out the Harlan place, lot by lot. 2 tractors, hay tools, milk cans, then the household goods nobody should have to price in public. The debt number passed between adults, in low voices, $84,000 at rates that had reset just high enough to crush them after 2 poor years. Ray remembered the sound of bids less than he remembered, Mrs. Harlan folding the sale bill into her coat pocket, with hands that would not stop shaking. His father drove home without the radio on, and said one sentence that lodged permanently: "Interest eats first." By 1966, Ray had saved $1,940 from summer detasseling, hog chores, and weekend welding jobs. He used $1,300 to buy a worn Alice Chalmers WD-45 with a weak starter and mismatched rear tires, then spent $214 on bearings, $88 on gaskets, and $46 on a salvage yard generator. The machine ran. More importantly, the process taught him that repair skills convert scarcity into optionality. Between 1967 and 1971, he rented 160 acres from an elderly widow who preferred punctual checks to ambitious speeches. Annual cash rent started at $32 per acre and rose to $41. He paid on time every March, purchased nitrogen only after soil tests justified it, and set a rule in pencil beside his yield notes. If a purchase cannot survive a bad year, it is not a good purchase. The first major fork came in 1973 when corn strength and optimistic lenders pushed everybody toward scale. Ray had two offers in the same month. A bank officer offered him a 5-year equipment note at 8.25% for a newer tractor and 6-row planter package, totaling $39,600, with monthly payments of $808. A retiring farmer offered a straight sale on his 1968 John Deere 4020 for $8,700 cash if Ray would take delivery before planting. Ray chose the second offer, then put $1,100 into injectors, hoses, and a clutch adjustment over the next 18 months. Side-by-side math made the decision non-trivial, but decisive. Financed package cost over 5 years with interest. $48,480, cash tractor plus repairs, $9,800. Savings, $38,680. That difference did not buy prestige. It bought resilience. His progression looked modest to outsiders and relentless to anyone reading the books. 1972. Net cash farm income $18,400. Savings rate 42%. 1974. Rented acreage increased to 240. Bought used grain drill for $350 cash. 1976. Purchased first 80 acres at $900 per acre, total $72,000 cash after 6 years of reserves. 1978. Gross crop revenue $126,300. Deferred machinery purchase added $31,000 to certificates of deposit at 9.1%. 1980. Total liquid reserves reached $402,000 after harvest. Winter livestock sales and CD interest carried liquidity to $514,000 by March 1981. This dynamic is what most neighbors missed. Ray was not anti-machine, anti-growth, or nostalgic for hardship. He was anti-fragility. He viewed debt service as fixed exposure against variable weather, variable prices, and variable policy. If 3 things can move against you at once, fixed obligations become a trap. So he built operations where his worst month could still be paid from cash, and his best month could be banked instead of celebrated. Before we go any further, if you want to see how one quiet ledger turned into a public reckoning in front of lenders and dealers, subscribe now, because the pivotal auction scene only makes sense once you see the numbers underneath it. By the second week of April 1981, his spring routine made the philosophy visible in small, repeatable acts. He ran the 4020 through a full pre-plant checklist on a clipboard laminated with tape, compression readings, hydraulic pressure, injector spray pattern, belt tension, and bearing heat checks after 1 hour under load. He kept a parts inventory on pegboard with handwritten counts and reorder thresholds, never glamorous, always current. That season's machinery budget was $9,300, and he finished at $8,964, including 2 rear tires bought at auction for $610 each instead of dealer retail at $1,040. He welded his own marker arm, rebuilt a seed meter with $74 in parts, and delayed replacing a toolbar until steel prices softened in late summer. Every delay had a reason. Every reason had numbers. At auctions, he stood near the back rail, bid rarely, paid immediately. In May, he bought a gravity wagon for $1,200 cash and sold an idle rake for $380 the same afternoon. In June, he passed on a cleaner-looking pickup because the transmission slip would have required $1,500 inside 6 months. In July, he rented an extra 80 acres only after penciling conservative yields at 112 bushels corn equivalent and confirming cash break-even below that line. Meanwhile, other operators signed annual renewals that looked manageable at 9.5% and catastrophic at double digits, though few expected rates to run that far. The contrast sharpened at home. Ray's kitchen table carried no decorative centerpieces, only envelopes marked seed, fuel, parts, tax, reserve, and giving. He placed fixed household cash in jars each month and lived inside those limits without drama. Clothing, $520 a year. Restaurant spending under $200. Vacation line, blank. He was not performing frugality for anyone. He simply preferred margin to display. The resulting tension in local opinion never quite resolved. People called him cheap, yet his bills cleared instantly. People called him outdated, yet his fields were planted on time. People said he was one breakdown from bankruptcy, yet he was the only one in that circle with 2 full years of expenses already covered. In September 1981, the first rate reset notices began landing across Marshall County. By July 1982, variable farm notes had climbed past 18.75% and then above 20%, while corn sagged near $2.35 per bushel and soybean margins thinned under input costs. At a dealership open house, Trent Malloy pressed a 36-month package at 12.9% on a new 4440 and a used combine and framed it as survival. Ray listened, took the worksheet, and gave his answer in 11 words. I buy what I can fix, and I pay cash only. That evening, he recalculated break-even at the same table. No term debt meant he could survive 2 poor crop years down to 102 bushels per acre. Malloy's package required 139 bushels just to clear annual payments and interest. The storm had arrived. Ray had already chosen his ground. By the last week of July 1982, the worksheets from Malloy Ag Equipment were still folded in Ray's shirt pocket, edges soft from handling, numbers unchanged. He set them beside his own ledger and marked one more line in pencil. Financed machinery package, annual obligation, $47,892, including interest and insurance rider. Cash repair plan projected annual machinery cash, $11,600 with a 10% contingency. Difference, $36,292 each year. Over 3 years, $108,876 preserved. That one subtraction would decide who slept and who stared at ceilings until dawn. The county began to split in 2 operating camps. One camp still believed refinancing would bridge one bad season. The other camp stopped believing in bridges built by lenders. Ray stayed quiet and kept planting, cultivating, fixing, storing, and selling in measured lots. He bought diesel in larger prepaid blocks when autumn basis improved, then logged every gallon against field passes. He reduced overlap by recalibrating marker spacing on the 12-row rig and shaved fuel use from 5.4 gallons per acre to 4.8 on his heaviest ground. 6/10 sounded trivial in coffee shop conversation. Across 640 acres, it saved 384 gallons. At $1.18 per gallon that year, it kept 400 $53.12 in his account. He treated every small number like a gate hinge. Ignore enough of them, and the whole operation swings open in a storm. Then the foreclosures began landing close enough to hear. Tom Hensley was first in Ray's immediate road circle, and nobody could say Tom had been careless. Tom was organized, up before light, fields clean, records neat. He had expanded to 480 owned acres and 320 rented during the high-price years, carrying $1,120,000 total debt at a blended 16.4% after 2 renewals. Annual debt service reached $183,680 before principal curtailments. In 1983, his corn averaged 118 bushels and beans 34 on stressed acres. Gross revenue did not cover note structure plus inputs. He sold stored grain into a week basis, then liquidated breeding stock to make spring operating terms. By February 1984, the bank accelerated covenants. By June, the sheriff's sale notice was tacked to the courthouse board. Tom lost the home quarter first, then the rented ground rolled away because no landlord wanted uncertainty. Mary and Dale Kruger held on longer and hurt deeper. They carried $742,000 across land, operating and machinery paper after a dry year and a variable reset they had not modeled above 14%. Their banker had once called them textbook borrowers. In 1984, drought stress cut yields enough that crop insurance narrowed losses, but did not restore working capital. They refinanced twice in 16 months, each renewal adding fees and unpaid interest. By October 1985, foreclosure was filed. At auction, they stood together, hands clasped, saying thank you to people they had known for 20 years, while strangers evaluated their line of equipment like inventory. Ben Ortiz went under on a different trap. His land debt was moderate, but he rolled machinery twice to keep up with payment timing and carried a $388,000 equipment note against depreciating collateral. When custom work demand softened and repair downtime hit, during harvest, cash flow snapped. He sold 2 units privately, still short. His lender refused another rollover. Ben did not lose his work ethic. He lost optionality. The Jensen brothers, Carl and Neil, were competent livestock and row crop men caught by stacking obligations. Total liabilities reached $905,000 when feed costs spiked and hog margins compressed. Their land had value, but value does not make monthly payments. By spring 1986, the note structure outran operating income. Their auction drew half the county, not out of spectacle, but respect. Harold Pike carried $267,000 unsecured operating debt after 3 seasons of borrowing inputs forward and hoping one good crop would clear it. Harold filed bankruptcy in 1986, ashamed of a number that had grown in increments too small to feel dangerous at first. He kept his hands in his pockets at the hearing and looked 20 years older when he walked out. And there was a 6th, quieter than the rest. Irene Bell, widowed, 200 acres owned clear but pressured into signing her son's expansion guarantee on a separate 360-acre lease operation. When his variable paper reset, her guarantee converted stress into liability. She sold 120 acres to settle exposure and kept the farmhouse and 80 acres. She did not lose everything on paper, but she lost the independence she had protected for decades. Ray attended every sale he could, often standing by the fence line with his cap low, not bidding until late lots, never discussing anyone's numbers unless asked directly. The cruelty of that period was not moral failure. It was timing plus leverage. Good farmers made one decision in one rate environment, and the environment changed faster than their notes. In that stretch, discipline looked slow only to people still timing recovery by hope. Debt moved faster than pride, and every reset date proved it. By harvest 1983, Ray's own sequence looked almost boring, and boring was the point. 1982. Net cash farm income, $41,300. Added $29,000 to reserves after taxes and repairs. 1983. Net cash farm income, $57,900. Bought no major machinery. Certificates of deposit laddered at 10.2% and 10.6%. 1984. Drought year, net cash farm, income $36,800. No emergency borrowing. Reserve draw, $11,400. 1985. Net cash farm income, $62,400. Refilled reserve and bought 80 acres for $72,000, cash from a retiring owner. 1986. Net cash farm income, $71,100. Bought adjacent 120 acres for $108,000 cash, closing in 10 days because no bank contingency was required. That ledger sequence created options at the exact moment options disappeared for others. By early October 1985, after the Kruger foreclosure was posted, Ray saw one need that banks would not touch: usable equipment with humane terms. At the auction, he bought the Kruger's 12-row planter for $9,400. He paid the clerk, took possession, and never moved it off their place. He walked back to Mary and Dale with a single handwritten line on ruled paper. "Pay me when you can, 0 interest, no schedule, keep it maintained." Dale looked down, then up, unable to answer for a long moment. Mary nodded once and said, "We will honor it," Ray replied. "I know." A week later, at his kitchen table, he formalized 3 private operating rules in blue ink. No borrowed operating money, no machinery purchase above 1/3 of 5-year average net farm income. Cash reserve target equal to 24 months of household plus farm overhead. At that point, his annual combined overhead averaged $112,400, so the reserve target was $224,800 minimum liquid. He kept more than that and did not announce it. When pressure climbed, those who lasted measured success less by what sat in the shed and more by how long they could operate without asking permission. By June 1987, the answer arrived in public at the court-supervised liquidation of Malloy Ag Equipment. Floor plan interest had climbed while inventory sat. New iron that once symbolized momentum now represented carrying costs, lender calls, and trustees with clipboards. Trent Malloy was there, jacket still pressed, voice tighter than anyone remembered. Ray parked the same 1972 Chevrolet by the fence, rust and all, and walked in with a cashier envelope. He bought a low-hour 1979 combine for $46,000 cash and a mixed parts lot for $7,800. Then he stepped to the clerk with a certified check for $212,000 to purchase 6 repossessed implements linked to failed local notes. The trustee asked for purpose. Ray answered in 9 words. Resell at cost. Beginning farmers. 0 interest. Service required. No speech. No drama. Trent asked the bank to verify funds. The officer made the call in front of bidders and returned with the same sentence that ended a decade of sales certainty. Funds immediately available. County paper reporters wrote it down as fast as they could. Trent later told one of them, "I told people debt was the only path, and he proved me wrong." He did not say it with bitterness. He said it like a man reading corrected math. Ray loaded the header, secured the chains, and drove home. By then, that arithmetic had started traveling county roads on its own, passed from one kitchen table to the next. By 1994, the outcomes were no longer theoretical. Tom Hensley, who had lost 480 acres, became grain elevator manager in Marshalltown at $42,000 salary to start, saved consistently, and rebuilt personal reserves to $184,000. Mary and Dale Kruger leased 240 acres debt-free, repaid Ray's planter note in 3 installments totaling $9,400 by 1991, and kept farming with repaired used equipment. Ben Ortiz built a custom baling and hay transport business with 2 paid-for tractors and seasonal gross receipts near $138,000. Carl and Neil Jensen shifted to livestock finishing on rented ground, cut fixed costs by half, and stabilized operations without long-term machinery notes. Harold Pike trained as a shop mechanic, cleared personal tax debt by 1992, and later supervised maintenance for a regional co-op. Irene Bell retained her 80-acre home place, leased it on flexible terms, and lived there through retirement with no remaining guarantees. Trent Malloy sold his house, moved to Des Moines, and took work as an equipment appraiser. The irony was quiet and complete. He became good at valuing used machinery and, by all accounts, began warning young operators against variable-rate machinery debt unless they had full-year reserves. Ray kept scaling carefully. By age 74, he held 1,360 owned acres, farmed additional rented ground under conservative cash terms, carried no debt, and maintained liquid reserves above his 2-year target. In 1996, he established the Westfield Fund with a $1,200,000 endowment. From 1997 through 2008, the fund issued 12 zero-interest equipment loans totaling $684,000. Terms were plain: maintain insurance, keep service logs, and help another operator once your note is clear. 9 recipients remained active years later, collectively operating 3,460 acres, valued near $23,800,000. That was the multiplier effect Ray cared about. Security converted into generosity. Generosity converted into continuity. His annual household spending remained lower than many single machinery payments in the county. Property tax and insurance adjusted upward over time. Food rose, utilities rose, parts rose. But personal consumption stayed modest. In several years, his giving exceeded household costs by more than 2 to 1. He still wore a faded cap. He still drove old trucks. He still trusted repaired iron more than polished promises. By the time younger operators repeated his rules from memory, the lesson no longer needed speeches. Appearance could mislead, but arithmetic rarely did, and quiet discipline, kept year after year, could hold a family through storms that image and borrowed momentum never survived. Ray never argued with the legend forming around him. He just opened the ledger and kept writing, because the only way to test a philosophy was to run it through more seasons than luck could explain. On the same kitchen table where he had penciled break even at 102 bushels, he started a new page after the Malloy liquidation and titled it with one plain line: "Capital preserved must become capacity shared." By November 1987, the first full post-crisis numbers were in. He had farmed 1,360 acres total, 1,040 owned and 320 rented, with corn averaging 127 bushels and soybeans 39. Gross crop revenue came to $312,640. Total direct costs, including seed, fertilizer, chemical, fuel, drying, and hired harvest help, were $171,900. $980. Machinery repairs and parts were $14,220, higher than his 5-year average because he rebuilt the combine clean grain elevator and replaced feeder house chains before failure. Net cash farm income closed at $84,700 after taxes and overhead. He swept $52,000 into certificates of deposit at 8.4% and left $210,000 liquid in operating cash, not because he feared growth, but because he wanted no lender within reach of his planting decisions. The 6 repossessed implements he bought for $212,000 were not treated as assets for display. He logged them as community notes receivable, 0 interest, principal only, with maintenance clauses. 3 beginning operators took units by spring 1988. 1 chisel plow at $18,500, 1 field cultivator at $14,200, and 1 grain drill at $11,800. No down payment theatrics, no balloon terms. Each note had a simple requirement that mattered more than speed. Keep service records, keep insurance, and do not roll this into any other debt. Cash returned slowly, but it returned clean. By the 3rd week of August 1988, drought had cut county optimism down to bare language. Ray's yields slipped to 109 bushels corn and 34 soybeans, and his net cash farm income fell to $52,600. He still did not borrow. Instead, he drew $19,300 from reserves to avoid forced grain sales at weak basis and held enough inventory into winter to improve realized price by 21 cents per bushel on 41,000 bushels. That timing alone added $8,610. He bought no land that year, bought no truck, and deferred a bin expansion that could have been justified on paper. The reserve after draw and replenishment closed at $593,000, still above his 24-month target by a wide margin. 1989 came in steadier. Corn recovered to 134 bushels, soybeans to 41, and net cash farm income rose to $93,400. He purchased 160 acres along a drainage corridor for $176,000, cash from siblings, settling an estate, then spent $12,700 on tile repair and grade work the first year. Most buyers would have financed at least half. Ray paid in full and kept $388,000 liquid afterward. People called it conservative. Arithmetic called it compounding. No mortgage interest meant the land had to pay only taxes and improvement, not debt service, so payback ran through operating margin instead of banker schedule. 1990 looked unremarkable unless you understood what unremarkable meant in farm finance. Net cash farm income, $88,200. Household spending, $31,480, including rising medical premiums and property insurance. Giving line, $36,000. He kept that giving off public lists, usually as equipment repairs paid directly to shops, seed invoices covered for operators with viable plans, or short bridge checks to prevent input discounts from being lost. He did not call it charity. He called it keeping good operators in the game. By January 1991, his 5-year average net cash farm income stood at $73,760, so his own machinery cap rule permitted a maximum single-year machinery purchase of $24,586. He stayed under it. That spring, he bought a used 1976 International Harvester, 1086 for auger and utility work at $12,400 cash. then put $2,180 into clutch and hydraulic service. Dealer quote on a newer comparable unit with financing would have run $41,900 plus interest. He saved the difference and, more importantly, avoided another fixed claim on uncertain weather. Let me stop here and ask you something. If your income can swing 40% on rainfall and prices you cannot control, would you rather own newer paint or own time? That was the exact moral choice sitting on county kitchen tables, even when people described it as equipment preference. 1991 closed at $97,800 net cash farm income. He laddered $75,000 into staggered certificates of deposit, 12-month, 18-month, and 24-month maturities, average yield 6.9%. He kept maturities offset so he would always have cash coming free without penalty. It was a small systems decision with large downstream effects. Liquidity became continuous rather than episodic. 1992 was wetter and slower. Planting delays pushed replant expense up, and net cash farm income eased to $74,900. He bought no acreage, no major iron, and spent $16,500 replacing 2 grain bin unload systems before harvest bottlenecks could force commercial storage costs. That preemptive spend avoided roughly $9,800 in projected custom drying and emergency hauling fees. On paper, it looked like maintenance. In practice, it was margin protection. 1993 tested everyone with waterlogged fields and quality discounts. Ray's corn yield dropped to 101 bushels on the lowest farms and 118 on better drained ground, averaging 111. Net cash farm income came in at $68,300. Several operators in the county, already leveraged, had to renew operating notes at terms that included curtailment clauses tied to post-harvest grain sales. Ray used reserves again, $23,400 this time, and did the opposite of panic selling. He stored what met condition, moved damaged grain quickly, and entered spring 1994 with no carryover debt and no covenant signatures. By the second week of December 1994, the long sequence became visible even to people who had dismissed him for years. Net cash farm income rebounded to $109,500 on stronger yields and improved marketing spreads. He purchased another 80 acres for $124,000 cash from a retiring couple who accepted his offer because it was clean, immediate, and required no appraisal contingency. Owned acreage moved to 1,280. Liquid reserves after purchase, taxes, and year-end giving still stood at $742,000. Notes payable remained zero. That same period is where the contrast with peers became impossible to ignore, and the crucial point is that most of those peers were disciplined workers, not caricatures of recklessness. They followed advice that had worked in easier credit years. They expanded. When extension meetings, lenders, and dealers all repeated the same paradigm. Scale first, refinance later, efficiency will cover the spread. For a while, it did. Take a representative machinery stack common in the county by 1984, one newer row crop tractor at $94,000, one late model combine at $128,000, 6-row planter and tillage package at $46,000, and a pickup at $21,000. Total financed exposure, $289,000 at 11.8% variable. Annual payment obligations and interest ran near $61,000 depending on term structure. At 18% reset, effective annual burden rose towards $78,000 when renewals and fees were included. That was before land notes, before fertilizer, before seed, before family living. Tom Hensley's structure showed the pressure in full scale. His $1,120,000 at blended 16.4% translated into annual interest near $183,680 before meaningful principal reduction. Even with strong management, one weak pricing window and one yield shortfall could erase working capital for 2 seasons. Mary and Dale Kruger's 700C $42,000 debt stack looked serviceable at lower rates, then turned rigid when drought clipped output and renewals added unpaid interest. Ben Ortiz's $388,000 equipment rollover looked efficient in high utilization years, then failed when custom demand softened and repair downtime hit the 1 month he needed uninterrupted harvest flow. Carl and Neil Jensen carried $900C $5,000 total liabilities into compressed hog margins and elevated feed costs. Land value could not convert to monthly liquidity fast enough. Harold Pike's $267,000 unsecured operating debt did what unsecured operating debt often does under stress. It accumulated invisibly until one renewal meeting made the real number undeniable. Irene Bell did not even borrow for herself in the conventional sense. She guaranteed someone else's expansion and absorbed the reset risk anyway. No one in that list lacked character. They lacked room. Debt narrowed their response set until every decision was made against a payment calendar. Ray's response set stayed wide because fixed obligations stayed low. In drought years, he could cut discretionary purchases and wait for basis. In wet years, he could spend on drainage and storage without opening new notes. In low-price years, he could hold grain and survive thinner margins. Zero debt did not create high yields or perfect weather. It created time, and time let good judgment operate. If you are learning something from this, pass it to one person who still confuses gross revenue with financial safety. Those are not the same number, and county history proved it repeatedly. The policy environment magnified the divide. Variable rates that had looked temporary in 1981 stayed punitive longer than many projections assumed. Credit committees tightened collateral standards after consecutive defaults. Input suppliers shortened payment windows. Some dealers required larger down payments or third-party guarantees for used machinery that had previously moved on handshake reputation. Banks inserted more frequent financial reporting covenants into renewals, which consumed attention precisely when operators needed attention on agronomy and marketing. None of those changes were personal. All of them were systemic. But systems punish fragility first. By spring 1995, land values had stabilized enough that aggressive buyers returned with leveraged bids, often justified by optimism on exports and productivity gains. Ray did not chase. He passed on 2 tracts where finance buyers paid $1,950 and $2,040 per acre because projected cash rent yields under realistic commodity assumptions did not satisfy his margin threshold without debt. He waited, and in 1996 acquired a different parcel at $1,620 per acre from a retiring owner who prioritized certainty. Patience outperformed urgency again. That same year, he formalized what had already been happening informally by creating the West Field Fund and endowing it with $1,200,000. The endowment structure protected principal and released lending capacity through repayments, so $1 could serve more than one operator over time. He was not trying to replace banks. He was trying to restore breathing room where commercial terms had become too rigid for viable beginners. The fund's first underwriting sheet borrowed directly from his own rules: debt to gross revenue cap, repair reserve requirement, and ban on variable rate machinery terms. The arithmetic beneath that design was straightforward. If the fund issued $684,000 total across 12 zero-interest equipment loans, average ticket $57,000, and if repayment rates stayed above 90% with principal recycled, the same capital could support multiple purchase cycles without chasing yield. Traditional finance asks, what return does this loan produce for capital? Ray asked, what continuity does this loan preserve for the county? Different objective, different outcome. By the end of 1996, his own operation remained visually unchanged enough to confuse newcomers. The same old truck still rattled down county roads. The same faded cap still sat on the dash. The same habit of standing quietly at auctions remained. Yet the ledger behind that appearance had become a durable framework. Owned ground growing without leverage spikes, reserves above 2-year overhead, machinery bought below cash flow thresholds, and a widening circle of operators still active because one man who looked broke had decided that stability, once earned, should circulate. On the last business afternoon of 1996, Ray cleared a corner of the kitchen table, stacked trust drafts beside his year-end ledgers, and wrote one figure on a yellow legal pad 3 times before sealing the envelope. $1,200,000. He checked bin sheets at dusk, set the certified check request form with his bank folder by the door, and left before sunrise in the same seed cap and work coat. 3 days later, Ray carried that circulation plan into First Prairie Bank in Marshalltown with a seed cap in his hands and dust still on his cuffs from bin checks. The lobby had polished tile, framed rate boards, and the quiet choreography of commercial lending. Ray asked for Ellen Voss, the trust officer handling charitable entities. She had prepared the formation documents for the Westfield Fund and expected an initial contribution in the range most local family funds started with, perhaps $100,000 to $250,000. That assumption lasted until Ray slid over a single-page balance sheet and a certified check. The check was for $1,200,000. Ellen read the amount once, then again, then looked to the attachment listing source accounts. $640,000 from maturing certificates of deposit, $380,000 from operating cash and grain sale proceeds, and $180,000 from a brokerage liquidation of conservative bond holdings he had built quietly over the prior decade. No borrowed funds, no pledged collateral, no transfer from a land sale. Pure internal capital. She asked the procedural question she was trained to ask. Do you want this phased over multiple tax years? Ray answered in 8 words. No. Put it to work this spring. By the second week of January 1997, the trustees met in a small conference room with coffee and foam cups and legal pads stacked at each seat. Present were Ellen, County Extension economist Paul Danner, retired implement mechanic Gene Larkin, and Ray. The fund charter required unanimous approval for each loan and prohibited variable rate terms, refinancing of existing commercial notes, and any purchase that pushed a borrower above a debt-to-gross revenue threshold of 0.35. They adopted a working reserve floor of $300,000 inside the fund, with all repayments cycling back to principal. Ray did not chair the meeting and did not take a title. He signed as founding donor and voting trustee. Then Ellen asked for a full donor financial disclosure for compliance and audit standards. Ray passed over the second envelope. Liquid cash and equivalents after the endowment transfer. $912,400. Debt, $0. Owned land, 1,280 acres, then appraised at $1,860 per acre average, total $2,380,800. Machinery and grain inventory, net of conservative depreciation, $486,000. Total net worth statement date, January 14th, 1997, $3,779,200. The room changed in a measurable way. Not loud, not theatrical. Gene leaned back and set his pen down slowly. Paul stopped mid-note and looked at Ray over his glasses. Ellen asked for permission to copy the statement into the trust file, and then said, almost to herself, "I would not have guessed this from your truck." Ray gave the small smile people in Marshall County knew well and replied, "Truck hauls the same with or without chrome." Word traveled because county systems always transmit non-trivial facts, especially when they correct a prevailing story. The man who had been used as a cautionary example for old iron was now publicly documented as one of the most liquid private operators in the region. There was no celebration dinner, no speech circuit, just a filed trust, a funded account, and an underwriting calendar. By late March 1997, the first applications arrived. Ray insisted each one include 3 pages, current assets and liabilities, 5-year yield history by field, and a written maintenance plan for whatever machine was being financed. He wanted judgment, not desperation, and he wanted tools that could earn, not toys that impressed. The first approved recipient was Caleb Morrow, age 24, leasing 180 acres from an uncle, and custom planting another 90. Caleb requested $58,000 for a used planter, no-till drill, and closing wheels package, priced at liquidation auction. Commercial offer available to him was 11.6% variable, with annual reset and a required blanket line on his crop proceeds. West Field terms were 0 interest, 7 years, annual principal of $8,286, insurance required, and quarterly service log review. Caleb accepted, made his first payment after harvest, and never missed one. By 2004, he had cleared the note and expanded to 520 acres, all with fixed cash rent and no machinery rollover debt. The second was Elena Ruiz, 31, running a small hay and cow-calf operation outside Conrad. She needed a reliable baler and rake package and had been quoted $41,200 finance plus fees. The fund approved $36,500 at 0 interest over 6 years after she sourced a cleaner used set at auction. Her annual payment was $6,083. The finance dealer package would have required roughly $8,900 per year once interest and insurance riders were included. Annual difference, about $2,817. Over 6 years, that preserved nearly $16,900 of working capital in an operation where one dry summer could erase margin. Elena used that margin to drill alfalfa on 42 acres and add custom baling routes. By 2006, her gross receipts reached $162,000 with no long-term machinery debt. The third was Owen Pike, Harold Pike's nephew, who had watched his family absorb the emotional cost of unsecured operating debt and decided to structure differently from day one. Owen requested $24,800 for a grain cart and auger setup to reduce harvest bottlenecks on 210 leased acres. Approved at 5 years, 0 interest, annual payment, $4,960. In the same season, he captured a basis improvement of 17 cents per bushel on 28,000 bushels by avoiding panic hauling. Added revenue, $4,760, almost his full annual payment. The arithmetic matched the philosophy on the first cycle. If you have ever wondered whether small financing terms can alter a whole county trajectory, this is where the decomposition matters. Each note looked modest alone. Together, they shifted survival odds. By August 1998, 3 more notes were active. Dana Kruger, daughter of Mary and Dale, received $44,000 for a combine header and grain platform upgrade tied to documented custom revenue. Scott Jensen, Carl's son, received $31,700 for feeding equipment after proving positive cash flow on rented lots. And Irene Bell's tenant operator, Matt Sorensen, received $19,600 for a drill that improved stand consistency on lighter soils. Every loan had identical constraints and identical dignity. No public scoreboard, no donor photo. Ray also continued direct quiet giving outside the fund when speed mattered. In 1999, after flood damage took out 2 bin fans on Ben Ortiz's hay storage, Ray paid $7,240 directly to the electrical contractor. No note attached. In 2000, when Tom Hensley needed $3,800 for certification courses to move from assistant to full elevator manager, Ray covered tuition and books with one condition: mentor 2 younger hires. Tom did both. By the first week of November 2001, the fund had issued 8 total loans, totaling $402,300, and received $126,900 in principal repayments. Delinquency, 0 days. Insurance compliance, 100%. Average borrower, debt to gross revenue at approval, 0.28. Average by third year, 0.17. That decline was the signal Ray cared about most. Borrowers were moving from fragile to durable. Then came 2002 and 2003, years that tested whether the framework worked only in easier weather. Input costs rose, basis widened in parts of Iowa, and 2 borrowers had yields under projection. Because no loan carried interest, shortfalls did not compound. Trustees adjusted payment timing within harvest windows without extending principal totals. Total repayment still tracked above 92% of scheduled principal by the end of 2003. A commercial structure with reset clauses would have pushed at least 2 operators into renewal penalties. 0 interest converted volatility into inconvenience rather than collapse. By mid-2004, the trustees unanimously approved the largest single note in fund history, $92,000 to Leah Brenner, a former agronomy technician, starting a 300-acre corn and soybean lease with her brother-in-law. She had $48,000 saved, requested machinery support only for assets with immediate field utility, and submitted the cleanest maintenance plan trustees had seen. Terms were 8 years. Principal only, annual payment $11,500. Leah cleared in 7 by applying a bonus payment after 2 strong crop years. By 2012, she operated 740 acres and had become a mentor reviewer for new applicants. The deeper examination was now on paper, line by line, and it demonstrated the underlying thesis with less romance and more force than any speech could. 1997. Fund capitalization, $1,200,000. Loans issued, $119,300. Year-end principal outstanding, $119,300. 1998. Loans issued, $95,300. Principal repaid, $18,600. Outstanding, $196,000. 1999. Loans issued $73,900. Principal repaid $34,200. Outstanding $235,700. 2000, loans issued $48,400. Principal repaid $52,100. Outstanding $232,000. 2001, loans issued $65,400. Principal repaid $56,800. Outstanding $240,600. 2002, loans issued $90,000. Principal repaid $61,300. Outstanding $269,300. 2003, loans issued $58,700. Principal repaid $66,200. Outstanding $261,800. 2004, loans issued $92,000. Principal repaid $74,100. Outstanding $279,700. 2005, loans issued $41,000. Principal repaid $81,400. Outstanding $239,300. 2006, no new loans. Principal repaid $88,600. Outstanding $150,700. 2007, no new loans. Principal repaid $74,900. Outstanding $75,800. 2008, final scheduled. Principal from initial cycle, repaid $75,800. Outstanding $0. Total loans issued from 1997 through 2008, $684,000. Total principal repaid, $684,000. Interest charged, $0. Document equipment retained in operation, beyond 5 years, 83%. Recipient farm survival rate, through first 10 years, 9 of 12 active, 2 merged voluntarily, 1 exited by choice without default. Now layer county scale value on top of that repayment performance. The 9 active recipients eventually operated 3,460 acres with average estimated value of $6,875 per acre at 1 benchmark review. Total land base value near $23,787,500. Not all of that was owned, and Ray never claimed it as a created asset. The more nuanced point was that zero-interest machinery access prevented early cash flow failure long enough for these operators to build equity in leases, improvements, and eventually land purchases. Continuity was the multiplier. Ray's own books during those same years remained stubbornly plain. Household spending in 2003 was $34,260. Annual giving, fund and direct combined, was $79,400. In 2005, household spending $36,110, giving $92,800. In 2008, despite higher medical and insurance costs, household spending $39,740, giving $101,300. The pattern held. Personal consumption grew slowly, generosity grew faster, and debt stayed absent. On a cold morning in January 2009, Ellen Voss closed the first cycle audit and mailed copies to trustees. The cover letter used language bankers reserved for rare files. Internally consistent, fully documented, no covenant breach, no impairment of principal. Ray read it at the kitchen table, folded it into the ledger drawer, and went outside to start the old 4020 for feed hauling. the same way he had done when people thought he could not last another season. He let the tractor warm at low idle, watched condensation lift off the muffler into pale morning light, and then carried Ellen Voss's audit letter back inside long enough to do one practical thing with it. He clipped the letter behind the original 1997 trust charter, behind the annual repayment sheets, and behind the 12 borrower files that now showed a full first cycle, closed at principal, returned in full, physical evidence filed, numbers preserved, no mythology required. Within 30 days, the outcomes started speaking for themselves in ways that no annual meeting could stage. Caleb Morrow, first borrower in, had already cleared his 7-year note early, and by 2009 was farming 520 acres with one hired hand, grossing $486,000 in a favorable year and holding debt to gross revenue under 0.20. He joined the fund's volunteer review panel and insisted new applicants submit repair budgets before yield projections. In 2013, he co-signed a private zero-interest note for a neighbor kid's $12,600 grain cart, mirroring Ray's format almost line for line. Elena Ruiz finished her 6-year note, then expanded custom baling routes across 3 townships. By 2011, she was running 2 paid-for balers, 1 mower conditioner, and a seasonal crew of 4, with gross receipts of $214,000 and no variable rate machinery paper. In a dry summer, when 2 smaller hay operators faced feed shortages, she deferred custom billing for 60 days at 0 markup and kept both accounts alive until winter sales came through. That single choice preserved 2 cow-calf herds, totaling 186 head. Quiet continuity. Owen Pike turned his $24,800 grain cart and auger loan into a logistics service model. He finished repayment in 5 years, then added contract hauling built around basis timing for smaller operators who lack storage. By 2014, his business handled 1.1 million bushels annually across harvest windows, and he taught his drivers one non-negotiable rule learned from Harold Pike's hard years: never cover a cash flow hole with unsecured operating debt if a cost cut can solve it first. Harold, who had once walked out of bankruptcy court, ashamed and silent, sat in the front row the first time Owen gave that talk at the county extension shop and cried without hiding it. Dana Kruger took the $44,000 header and platform upgrade and built predictable custom harvest income before attempting land purchases. She and her husband leased 310 acres by 2012, then bought their first 120-acre tract with a fixed-rate mortgage they could service at conservative yield assumptions. Her mother, Mary, kept the old zero-interest planner note receipt in a kitchen drawer as a reminder that rescue and accountability can occupy the same page. Scott Jensen used the $31,700 feeding equipment note to stabilize winter gain metrics in livestock finishing and reduced feed waste from 8.2% to 5.6% within 2 seasons. That margin improvement covered his annual principal and financed a manure handling upgrade without additional debt. His father, Carl, and Uncle Neil, who had lived through the $905,000 liability collapse, called it the first time in 20 years that growth felt calm instead of urgent. Matt Sorensen, Irene Bell's tenant operator, improved stand consistency enough on lighter ground to lift average soybean yield by 4.8 bushels per acre over 3 seasons. He cleared his $19,600 note early, then signed a long-term flexible lease with Irene that kept her 80-acre home place intact and productive until her death at 91. She passed it home, debt-free, in the room facing the west field. Leah Brenner paid her $92,000 note in 7 years, added drainage where numbers supported it, and by 2018 operated 740 acres, with disciplined fixed costs and full maintenance logs that became model documents for new applicants. She later helped evaluate 2 second-cycle applicants after the original lending round closed, preserving the same underwriting standards Ray had insisted on in 1997. By the second week of May 2010, the multiplier was measurable across linked households rather than individual anecdotes. 12 original loans had touched 12 operations directly. Through mentorship requirements and private follow-on notes, those 12 operators assisted another 17 starts or near restarts with documented equipment access, temporary labor sharing, or bridge financing. Of those 29 total operations, 22 remained active after 10 years. 4 merged by choice and 3 exited without default. The combined acreage under those active and merged operations reached 4,120, with benchmark land value estimates in one review year near $28,300,000. Ray never claimed ownership of that figure. He called it preserved local capacity. If one equation captured his framework, it was this: $684,000 lent at zero interest, generated $684,000 repaid, then produced more than $27 million in durable operating footprint over time through survival, reinvestment, and handoff behavior. Same principle, wider impact. Trent Malloy's resolution unfolded without spectacle, but with clarity. After moving to Des Moines and taking appraiser work, he became known for conservative valuation reports that punished optimism premiums and flagged variable rate exposure in plain language. In 2011, when a regional lender asked him to prepare training notes for young loan officers, he included a 1-page case study titled Marshall County Note Stress Example. The anonymized file was Ray's 1982 break-even worksheet alongside a financed package model. Trent's summary line read, "Fixed obligations must be survivable at adverse yield and adverse price simultaneously." He never returned to dealership sales. He did, however, return once to Marshall County for a farm finance panel at the Extension Hall. Paul Danner moderated. Gene Larkin sat in the second row, retired and still taking notes out of habit. Trent spoke for 18 minutes and used no defensiveness. He said he had mistaken volume for viability, had treated refinancing as strategy rather than temporary relief, and had watched good operators pay for that error. After the panel, he walked to Ray by the coffee urn and offered a direct sentence. "You were right about optionality." Ray answered, "Numbers were right. We both had to learn." That was the entire reconciliation. The county paper followed with a Sunday piece that quoted both men and printed the repayment totals from the Westfield files. External contact resolved. Public record corrected. The old jokes about Ray's truck stopped after that. Not because people suddenly admired rust, but because they now understood what had been financed by refusing polish. Roll call came naturally in the years that followed, because Marshall County kept track of its own. Tom Hensley retired from grain elevator management with personal savings above $410,000, then helped his daughter purchase a house without taking on high-interest consumer debt. Mary and Dale Kruger continued leasing 240 acres into their 70s, then transitioned acreage to Dana under a staged agreement that kept cash obligations low and equipment paid for. Ben Ortiz expanded custom baling into transport logistics and later sold half his route to a younger operator he mentored, creating his first true retirement income stream. Carl Jensen passed in 2017 after a short illness. Neil still runs livestock on rented ground with Scott handling feeding technology and records. Harold Pike retired from co-op maintenance in 2015 with tax debts, long cleared and spent winters rebuilding small engines for neighbors at modest rates. Irene Bell's home place remained in production under the lease she structured before passing, and Matt Sorensen continues to farm it under the same soil conservation terms. Ellen Voss retired from trust work in 2014 and left behind what auditors called one of the cleanest rural philanthropic files in the region. Paul Danner published a county extension bulletin using aggregated anonymous numbers from the fund to demonstrate that machinery terms influence farm survival as much as yield variance in stressed credit cycles. Gene Larkin died in 2019. His family donated his notebooks to the local historical society, including service logs from fund-financed equipment that still had readable grease pencil notes in the margins. Ray West stayed exactly as he had been in the details that fooled people first. Faded cap, worn coat, old truck repaired instead of replaced. He eventually retired the 1972 Chevrolet after the frame corrosion crossed his own safety threshold, then bought a used replacement with cash, and no comment. The 1968 John Deere 4020 remained operational for utility work and demonstration days, maintained with the same checklist cadence that had carried him through the worst years. Still running, still useful, still paid for. His final personal balance sheets, prepared in his late 70s, showed 1,360 owned acres, strong liquid reserves, no debt, and annual giving that continued to exceed household spending. He set inheritance terms that required heirs to demonstrate 3 years of net saving and debt discipline before receiving full control of productive assets. Conditional, not punitive. He wanted continuity, not dependence. He died peacefully at home in early winter, after morning chores, with ledger pages current through the prior week. There was no dramatic final speech. At visitation, people who had once stood at foreclosure fences stood beside people who had started farms with fund loans. They compared repair notes, rainfall records, and payment calendars. Leah Brenner brought copies of the original underwriting checklist for younger operators who asked how to begin. Caleb Morrow and Dana Kruger announced they would continue a private lending circle modeled on the Westfield terms, capped at machinery that could be serviced and paid without optimism. The last administrative threads were closed in order. Ray's old Malloy worksheets were donated with his permission letter to the County Historical Archive, where they now sit beside the first Westfield audit. The trust board recorded all outstanding, informal, direct gifts as forgiven upon death, unless active borrowers elected to continue repayment into the fund. 7 chose to continue and did. The annual county paper follow-up that had started after Trent's panel ran one final table. Principal lent, principal returned. Recipients active, acreage operating. Defaults none in the original cycle. If you want more stories where arithmetic overturns surface judgment, subscribe now. If you have lived through a hard rate cycle, comment with the one rule you wish you had been taught at 25. Share this with one operator who confuses high gross revenue with safety, because those are different numbers and one of them can vanish quickly. The final image stayed simple because the truth had always been simple. A man in faded clothes kept fixed obligations low, kept reserves high, and kept choices open long enough to help other people do the same. He looked poor in every parking lot that graded wealth by paint. He was rich where it counted, on paper, in patience, and in the number of neighbors who got a second chance because he refused to finance appearances. The week after the visitation, sleet tapped the machine shed roof while Caleb Morrow spread 12 borrower files across Ray's old workbench, the same bench where Ray had kept injector shims in labeled jars and grease pencil notes on cardboard. Dana Kruger brought a metal cash box from the Westfield office cabinet. Leah Brenner carried a binder thick with service logs and repayment histories. Owen Pike arrived last, set down a yellow envelope, and said what all of them had already been circling. "We keep it moving." No one answered quickly. The silence was practical, not dramatic. They were reading figures. By January 17th, 2010, the active former recipients had drafted a continuation structure called the Field Continuity Circle, separate from the original trust but modeled on the same terms. 0 interest, principal only, insurance required, service logs mandatory, and no variable rate machinery debt attached to funded equipment. Caleb committed $90,000. Leah committed $110,000. Dana and her husband committed $55,000. Elena Ruiz wired $75,000 from retained earnings in her custom hay account. Owen committed $40,000. Scott Jensen added $28,000. Matt Sorensen added $22,000. 2 additional former recipients who had merged operations contributed $30,000 and $18,000. Opening pool, $468,000. The first 2 notes under that circle were signed that same afternoon at Ray's kitchen table, with Ellen Voss invited as witness in her trust officer role. Borrower 1, Tyler Hensley, Tom's nephew, received $36,400 for a used grain drill and cart package, priced below dealer lot comparables by $11,700. Borrower 2, Rachel Pike, Harold's granddaughter, received $19,800 for a haying set tied to contracted acreage already documented. Both notes ran 6 years, principal only. 3 days later, the county paper called for comment on whether this was symbolic or functional. Leah gave the only quote they needed. "We are not honoring Ray with words. We are honoring him with terms." By the first week of March, the original Westfield records were cataloged at the county archive. The box included the 1982 Malloy worksheet, the 1997 trust charter, the 2009 clean audit letter Ellen had clipped for Ray, and the handwritten rule page in blue ink. Physical evidence resolved, indexed, and open to public review by appointment. The archivist noted one detail in her intake form that made people smile for years. The paper still smelled faintly of diesel and machine oil. Spring planting that year tested whether legacy was sentiment or structure. Corn input costs jumped again, and 2 younger operators asked for deferred payment schedules before their notes had even reached first anniversary. The circle reviewed both at the shed office table and approved timing adjustments without adding fees or interest. They did exactly what Ray had done in 2002 and 2003, convert volatility into inconvenience instead of collapse. Both operators stayed current by year-end. The multiplier widened in ways that were measurable. By harvest 2012, the 9 long-term active original recipients, plus 8 circle-supported second-wave operators, controlled or leased 4,980 acres combined. At an estimated benchmark value of $7,240 per acre that year, the operating footprint sat near $36,055,200, not owned by one person, not credited to one fund, but preserved through the same underlying rule set. Survive first, expand second, never let fixed payments outrun realistic yields. Trent Malloy saw those numbers in print from a desk in Des Moines, where he had spent the previous decade writing conservative equipment appraisals and loan risk memos. In September 2012, at a lender workshop in Polk County, he presented a slide titled Payment Stress Under Adverse Yield and Adverse Price, then paused before speaking and removed his glasses. "I sold urgency for too long," he said. "I treated refinancing as a strategy. It is not. It is a temporary bridge at best." He cited the Marshall County case file without naming Ray, then added one sentence he had once resisted saying in public. "The operators who lasted kept optionality." When he retired in 2016, Trent sent a one-page letter to the county extension office requesting it be attached to the archive panel transcript from his Marshalltown appearance. Paul Danner added it to the file. In the letter, Trent wrote that he had built a good income in sales, watched too many good farmers absorb avoidable risk, and spent his last professional years advising the opposite of what he had once pushed. Antagonist thread closed with full admission, documented and filed. By June 2018, roll call at the Marshall County Fairgrounds became an annual habit. Not a ceremony with polished speeches, just folding chairs in a livestock meeting room, coffee in paper cups, and a whiteboard with 3 columns: acres, debt structure, repair reserve. Tom Hensley attended with his daughter and handed Tyler a copy of his first savings worksheet from the elevator years, the one that started at 0 and climbed to $184,000. Mary and Dale Kruger came slower now, but they still came. Dale carried the original planter note receipt in an envelope softened by decades of handling. Ben Ortiz arrived in a work truck with baling twine in the bed and gave 2 younger operators his route planning template. Neil Jensen came with Scott and sat near the aisle, hat in his lap, listening more than talking. Harold Pike, retired, still checked repair logs with a mechanic's eye and circled skipped service intervals in red ink. Matt Sorensen read Irene Bell's soil conservation clause aloud each year before lease renewals were discussed, because she had asked him to keep doing it. Carl Jensen's name stayed on the whiteboard with a small mark beside it, a simple sign that his line had not ended with his death. Ellen Voss attended when weather allowed and corrected sloppy paperwork without apology. Paul Danner brought county-level commodity and rate tables and translated them into plain language for first-generation operators in the room. Gene Larkin's notebooks, now in the Historical Society collection, were copied and passed around for maintenance reference whenever an older unit came up for financing. Ray's farm remained in operation under the inheritance terms he designed. The heirs met the 3 years savings and debt discipline requirement, then assumed management without liquidating core acreage. As of 2022, the operation still held 1,360 owned acres, leased a modest additional block on conservative cash terms, and carried no long-term machinery debt. The 1968 John Deere 402 still ran utility duty on feed and auger work after a preventive overhaul that cost $6,940 logged to the hour. The used replacement pickup Ray bought late in life, a 2003 3/4 ton, with 212,000 miles at purchase, crossed 300,000 miles under the same maintenance rule. Fix early, pay cash, keep records. One small thread many people remembered from the beginning finally got its own quiet closure. The 1972 Chevrolet C20 with the tailgate that latched only if lifted first had been parked after retirement in a dry bay behind the machine shed. In 2021, the family declined collector offers and donated it to the county historical grounds, not as a showpiece, but as a teaching exhibit beside the ledger copies. Children at field days climbed into the cab and asked why anyone kept a truck that old. The answer on the placard was pure Ray, because a paid-for tool can carry more future than a financed image. By October 2024, the combined original fund legacy and continuation circle lending had financed 31 machinery notes totaling $1,152,300 with zero interest. Principal repaid stood at $1,046,900, with the remaining notes current and no default write-offs. Active operators connected to that chain were farming 5,340 acres. The estimated benchmark land value attached to those operations, owned and leased mix, stood near $41,900,000. Again, not a claim of ownership, a measure of continuity. The thesis never needed embellishment. A man in stitched knees and worn gloves kept a reserve target when others chased appearance. He chose repairs over prestige, cash over urgency, margin over applause. When crisis exposed the trade-offs, his stability turned outward and financed second chances for neighbors who had the skill to farm, but not the breathing room to survive bad terms. Years later, the county still uses his arithmetic and loan workshops, still references his blue ink rules, still points to the old truck and the old 4020 and the archived worksheets as evidence that discipline is not nostalgia. It is a framework. He looked poor at the scale house. He was liquid when it mattered. He stayed quiet when he was mocked. He stayed generous when he was vindicated. And in Marshall County, where weather and price still move without asking permission, families who never met him now farm on terms he proved could last.